Glad to have you back. Now, for the first time, the federal government has actively discouraged monopolistic practices, marking a significant shift in Nigeria's economic field. Monopolies have been long been associated with market inefficiencies, unfair consumer practices, and stifled innovation. When a single entity controls the supply of a good or service, it can artificially inflate prices, restrict competition, and limit alternatives for consumers. This dominance creates barriers to entry for professionals, competitors, leading to inferior products and general lack of incentives for improvement. Well, Nigeria's oil and gas industry has seen a lot. Let's talk to Mr. Kelvin Emmanuel. He is an economist and energy analyst from our Abuja studios. Mr. Emmanuel, thank you so much for joining the program today. We appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon. I think I will start with what you think post-deregulation and this pricing thing. Today, it's on the high side. Tomorrow, it's on the low side. Some experts like you will say that was expected. But really, how would you continue? How would you assess the market post-deregulation?
So, you know, it's interesting, your opener, you talked about monopolies, and then when you look at the World Trade Organization rules on dumping and veiling, you realize that for 20 years, before Dangote started last year, there were no standards in the midstream sector. In fact, there was no midstream sector in Nigeria, because what you basically had was a crude intervention stock of 445,000 barrels per day, was used for crude oil swap to bring in products. NMDPR didn't have a lab to test. So if you had a market that didn't comply with the PIA, that the government wrote, by the way, so that was signed in 2021 of August, you know, and then Dangote showed up, it's producing PMS that is even better than the standard that has been set at section 317.11 of the PIA on the 50 ppm for sulfur. Where does the regulation come into place? Considering NNPC borrowed $2.4 billion to do turnaround maintenance for Warri and Port Harcourt, and then it's still importing petrol. Where does it come into place? So the midstream sector, like you have it today, is a situation basically where the refiner Dangote is having to import crude that is using to refine. The domestic crude supply obligation, sections 109 of the PI, is not being complied with. NUPRC is not enforcing the sections 109 of the Petroleum Industry Act of 2021. The refiner has to buy crude oil at a premium with commissions added, you know, for the stock that is given. Even the Naira-based crude swap, Dangote is getting less than 65,000 barrels per day as allocation under Naira-based crude swap, considering that it's currently doing 600,000 barrels per day, you know. So, you know, in my assessment, it's a good development that the government decided to comply with sections 205 of the Petroleum Industry Act on the regulating the prices of PMS and stop the, you know, government regulation and subsidy it had on that. But the government also needs to, you know, see that they do backward integration and stop the importation of substandard products into Nigeria. If the other players want to compete, they should form a consortium and build another refinery to compete with Dangote. That's how to compete. Not when one person is giving preferential treatment and the other person is playing by the rules.
But I would ask you, many would say in every country, we still have the national oil company playing a role. It's in Brazil, it's in New York, it's in the UK. So what really, to you, is the role of the national oil company in all of this?
The role of the national oil company, the bread and butter of NNPC, which is the state-owned enterprise for the oil and gas sector in Nigeria, is not to take revenues from crude oil it leaves upstream and then subsidize inefficient operations midstream and downstream. Their bread and butter is in exploration and production. That's their bread and butter, because that's the arm of NNPC group that has the capacity to generate 90% of revenue. There is an Italian mathematician called Vilfredo Pareto. He came out with the Pareto principle that says 20% of your activities will give you 80% of results. So it's interesting that, you know, NNPC is not focused on, you know, developing technical capacity to be able to directly operate the field that it manages under former MPDC and now NEPL to increase the amount of crude oil that is produced per day. NNPC, that's NEPL, does not do up to 200,000 barrels per day in contribution to the 1.53 million barrels per day it currently produces net of condensates. Okay, so the role of the national oil company is to follow the models that you had for like Petrobras, Petronas, in Malaysia, Petrobras in Brazil, Aramco in Saudi Arabia, to ensure that you can, develop efficiency, focus on your strengths, increase output for oil and gas upstream, and work with the operators under UJVs and production sharing contracts to optimize the share of the government's ownership for oil and gas upstream, and then supply the midstream players in the private sector to be able to, compete with other markets, supply the domestic market, export the difference for net export proceeds that will come to the central bank for balance of payment. That's the role of a state oil company. Its role is not to compete with Dangote, considering that the government, through NNPC, owns 7.2% in the refinery.
But we've seen some government refineries come on stream in recent times. First is Port Harcourt, and I think something is happening around Warri at the moment. And we expect the likes of Kaduna and all of that to also come on stream very quickly. What do you also make of those moves in trying to make the local refineries that never used to be functional, for a long time? Yeah, they used to be before now, but at least in recent times. But we see them begin to produce products. What do you also make of that?
Well, I'm happy you asked that question, and this has been a subject of debate for several months. But the evidence, what does the evidence speak to? Because the evidence is what matters. The evidence is what tells you whether the propaganda is false or is true. Listen, Port Harcourt and Warri, currently as we speak, do not have active catalytic reforming units. And it's interesting because the monies that were used for turnaround maintenance for Port Harcourt and Warri were actually borrowed. The government didn't have the money to give. FEC basically gave out a contract award letter, and NNPC used that contract award letter as an instrument to raise finance through crude oil swap, where it pledged Nigeria's crude that is not finished paying, by the way, in exchange for upfront cash used for turnaround maintenance. So if you don't have a functional catalytic reforming unit that can break naphtha, which is the base compound for cracking PMS into secondary and tertiary derivatives like premium motor spirit, how does it justify you spending $2.4 billion in TAM? Look, Port Harcourt and Warri cannot even recover petroleum gases, which is typically called LPG, which every refiner around the world is able to recover from cracking PMS. It's a natural derivative of distilling into PMS. Kaduna, by the way, Kaduna has two major problems. It has CDU1, CDU2. CDU1 can do about 50,000 barrels per day. CDU2 can do 60,000 barrels per day. CDU2, however, cannot process any blend of Nigerian crude. So the total for Kaduna is 110, but CDU2 cannot process any of the 34 blends of Nigerian crude because CDU2 only accepts heavy crude that has API degree less than 26.6 degrees. Number two problem Kaduna has, the 674-kilometer pipeline that will transport crude from Escravos through the Chanomi Creeks down to the north is out of service. And I've always said that, listen, the government needs to move from this thing of NNPC through NSPC, controlling multi-product pipeline from a closed loop to an open access, concession the pipes to the private sector, players in the sector who have the capacity to manage it, bringing the communities through a community policing-led approach to manage those pipelines to prevent vandalization. Because you can't move crude oil, considering that the inland waterways are not properly dredged for barges to move crude oil feedstock from the Niger Delta to Kaduna by either barges or trucks. So how are you going to move crude oil? So if tomorrow NNPC comes and announces to you that Kaduna is currently functioning, ask them these questions I've asked. So we need to move away from this model of using Nigeria's crude, borrowing money at high interest to subsidize very inefficient operations at NNPC refineries, to actually allowing the private sector players to play in the market, while the government focuses on upstream production of oil and gas, supply them. That's the way you optimize the market, and that's the way you can provide the effects the government needs to do balance of payment to stabilize the naira, and also increase the amount of revenue the government gets from selling that dollars to provide monies for the government to fund its budget so that you don't have high budget deficits, which in 2025, by the way, is about 13 trillion naira.
Moving forward now, you talked about the issue of standards. That's the quality of the product coming up from Dangote refinery and all. Recently, we saw that there was an issue that played out with regards to standards where someone on social media came up with some of all of it. But my question to you really would be, what's your take with regards to the standard of petroleum products coming from, of course, Dangote refinery, because most marketers are buying from that refinery at the moment?
Well, you know, if you visit the Dangote refinery in the free trade zone in Lekki, I have visited. I have been privileged to visit the refinery in Lekki. You see that it has world-class labs that will compete with any refinery around the world, including the one that ExxonMobil commissioned in Texas last year. You know, it will compete with any refinery around the world. It has labs that test for everything from density to crude assay reports for crude feedstock that they have coming, to the motor and research octane number, to distillation level, to sulfur level. It has a world-class lab, more than 10 different labs in one. Okay, so everything that comes in and goes out of refinery is tested. I can, defend the quality of product that comes from Dangote because empirical results that has been shown to stakeholders and regulators and governments who have visited around the world has shown that it meets up with regulatory standards anywhere in the world. ASTM standards, European EN standards, Colonial standards, American Petroleum Institute standards in the US, and different regulatory standards in different regions of the world. Now, there is a provision in the Petroleum Industry Act, okay, sections 317, 11, that says that all players in the market in the Economic Committee of West African States, based on a February 2020 convention that was held, are subject to 50 parts per million for sulfur that measures the ash content of the petrol for any petrol that is within the jurisdiction of the ECOWAS. That's the law. It's a law that Nigeria, by being member of ECOWAS, is bound to comply with. Now, when that law came out in 2020, NMDPRA came out and said that they were going to put out an allowable limit of 200 ppm. But it expired December 31, 2024, so they've reverted back to 50 ppm. The question I have for you today, can NMDPRA as a regulator for mid and downstream, conduct a third-party Robin roundtable, pick samples from the NNPC refineries, pick samples from Dangote, pick samples from the petrol that is imported to Nigeria, for which you had about over 400 million liters for December, and then you had about NNPC import 213.2 million liters in the first 2 weeks in February.
Well, that has been challenged.
Pick samples, test it.
That has been challenged.
There's data. The government
ahead.
came out with the report and said, the statement, and said that they were importing 25 million liters. So there's data to back it, because when you check the shipping tally of the products, the liquid bulk products that come into Nigeria at the ports in Apapa and to the other ports in Nigeria, you see that statement has been confirmed. Let them come out and dispute that the shipping tally is wrong. The motor tanker vessel report shows that they imported 213.2 million liters of PMS in the first 2 weeks of February. It's a fact. Okay? If NMDPRA conducts a test on samples taken from all these quarters, will it show that the product they sell in Nigeria meets up with the 50 ppm allowable sulfur limit that was specified by ECOWAS in its February 2020 convention, that is also contained in the Petroleum Industry Act, by the way, that the government wrote and passed as a law? Will it show? That's the question we have to ask the regulators.
Interesting stuff. Now, as we wrap this up now, what is your outlook for the entire sector? Now, that's about the downstream now, moving forward in 2025. Pricing and all of that.
I think that Dangote has done fantastic work establishing an equalization fund to create uniformity of pricing across different regions, because the logistics for distribution is completely non-existent. Evacuation and distribution is a problem. I think it contributes anywhere around 14 to 20 naira per liter in the southwest, and above 20 naira per liter in other parts of Nigeria. And that's because you don't have pipes to evacuate product from the refinery. And Dangote is not Dangote's responsibility to build infrastructure to evacuate PMS, because anything outside the single point mooring or the gantry is not his business. It's completely left to the infrastructure the government has provided. So I think that the government needs to look into concessioning those pipes and, like I said earlier, adopting a community-led approach to prevent vandalization of those pipes through the right-of-way fee sharing structure. In 2025, depending on how the price of crude and the obedience to domestic crude supply obligations in sections 109 of the PIA and the exchange rate goes, we might see fluctuations in the price. But Nigerians need to, get used to the reality that PMS prices in any deregulated part of the world, the regulated markets in the world, is not static. It moves based on price of crude and exchange rates. Okay, we need to get into that reality that the static price that the government has created inefficiencies and led to serious losses of revenues to the government and instability and distortions in the markets, and that petrol prices are not to be static. But I'm optimistic that in the future, as the markets become more mature in the midstream and as the government begins to comply with domestic crude supply obligations in sections 109 of the PIA, that Nigerians might see lower petrol prices incrementally.
Great stuff there. I would have you in again to look at all of these assessments. Mr. Kelvin Emmanuel, really interesting talking to you. Economist, energy analyst, thank you for joining us from our Abuja studios. Do enjoy your weekend.
Thank you for having me.